All right. Next, we have Amber and Conrad speaking to us on e-cargo bikes and the future of our pedal future. Sure, something like that. Big fans, big fans. Let's go.
All right, thank you, Jason. All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Amanda, and I work in public space and mobility policy as a transportation planner. So prior to coming to the city, I do have experience within economic development and technology, and I worked for a company that actually helped put those tiny mile robots on Toronto streets. So I'm very familiar with this landscape of the fact that we have a lot of change coming in our pedestrian and public spaces. And so a part of my interest in being here is how do we maintain that space in a way that it's still accessible and safe for pedestrians?
Good morning, folks, and to anyone joining online, thank you for gracing us with your presence here this morning. I think following on what Travis was saying with public space and mobility in action through the robotic technologies he spoke about, I think it's a great segue into what we will discuss here today. And my name is Conrad Kassir. I'm also with Public Space and Mobility Policy. And part of my interest in being here is anything to do with the little letter E in front of whatever goods movement or people movement or whatever moves things. And with things also mean people. Whatever we're moving, if we can do it in a zero emission way, if we can do it in a low carbon way, then I'm interested. So I've got a bit of a background in policy work, in international development, and looking at the difficult questions around electric and other forms of mobility and how to get us from policies to implementation. It's a very long journey to make those things happen, but yeah, today we'll address shortly how to move goods in urban environments, and I'd like you to think about Calgary as a growing city. More and more people are moving to cities. By 2050, more or less 70% of people globally will be living in urban environments, which means that the way we move ourselves and our goods probably should adapt.
Great, thank you. So how we're going to structure this presentation is a bit of a dive into why this change is occurring and what are the drivers of that. As we look at drivers, it'll be a question of why consider e-cargo bikes in the first place. Then we'll provide some examples of where this change is actually happening. So there is a quiz on this portion of the presentation, so do keep your thinking caps on. And then lastly, we'll loop it back to the Calgary context to get a sense of what policies and tools we need to use in order to enable or even manage the technology that does come onto our streets. So this is the why. And there is certainly a lot of overlap between the why of e-bikes and the why of delivery robots that Travis mentioned as well. And the first why that we found again and again and again is that consumer demand has changed. Unsurprisingly, during COVID, there was a lot of shift to e-commerce and digital-only marketplaces like Amazon. And conservative estimates now say that approximately, if we look at 10 people in the room right now, 6 of you are shopping online at least once per month. Again, that's very conservative, and we can understand that with that change comes a change in consumer expectations with how those deliveries arrive to them. So the new expectation is that you're getting a delivery same day or next day, and you're getting it delivered directly to your house. So from a logistics provider standpoint, that's putting a lot of pressure on them to manage deliveries in a way that is efficient, expedient, and is satisfying their consumers. Secondly, with additional vehicles on the road, we are seeing an increase in congestion and just overall emissions on our streets. As delivery vehicles are typically diesel run, when they're sitting and idling in traffic, that does cause some pressure on the pressure on causing increased emissions and pollutions within our cities. So from, again, the logistics providers are thinking about ways that they can manage their emission outputs in a more sustainable fashion, which is leading a bit of the change there. And then the last consideration is for worker safety and then also public safety. Delivery vehicles are heavy machines, and unfortunately there's really no easy way to put this, but when delivery vehicles or vans are involved in collisions with motorists, they're more likely to lead to a fatality than with other smaller vehicles. So it's definitely something to consider from both the logistics standpoint and then also from the city standpoint. How do we manage this change that is rapid and oncoming? So in the Calgary context, there is definitely a lot of economic activity and that is happening within goods movement. So from the data that we have, from 2002 to 2017, daily truck volumes increased by over 55% on Calgary roads. And this is a conservative estimate and also an outdated estimate, as you know that Calgary's population is steadily continuing to grow. Some of the goods that are moving through this network that already exists here are just listed here in this chart. And when we think about e-cargo bikes, it's really essential to think about what commodities are what commodities are suitable to move within an e-bike, such as the one that we have here up front. Everything that's listed in this bright red, it's a heavy industry. That's not necessarily a commodity that's suitable, appropriate, or even right-sized for an e-bike. But on these general freight and food products, these are products that are going typically directly to consumers, and they might present a really great opportunity to move products from businesses directly to consumers, even part of the time. So we're not necessarily thinking about a full replacement of consumer goods through e-bikes, but more of a way to supplement how we move goods around Calgary.
My turn. So if we speak about electric cargo mobility, first of all, take a look at this bike over here. We're very happy that we could loan this from the bike shop here nearby. And this is an example of what we mean by electric cargo mobility as a possible solution to improve our goods movement across not just the greater downtown here in Calgary, but also other areas, communities, neighborhoods. And maybe it inspires neighboring municipalities as well to think about how we can use these innovative tools. So on this particular bike, you'll see there is a loading space here in front. Some bikes do have the loading bays at the back or elsewhere. So this configuration of how this bike is built is only one example and really brings about the option of being innovative in how we deliver our goods. I'm not too sure exactly what the load capacity of this one is, but we'll get to it. Okay. So yeah, great thanks to the bike shop for letting you see this in person. So if we think about getting this to be a more day-to-day around Calgary, we've got to think about what are some of the drivers that lead us to implementing these types of technologies. So the first thing we see from our research and what we see out and about every day is that innovation matters. And there are two areas that I want to touch on today. One is the technological advancement, both in modular and electric innovation. And it's also spaces like this here at the Wave where we can really play with these kind of questions around how to innovate. Which questions should we be asking about innovation in this space? What kind of research and development would be the correct research and development so that we can solve the correct problem around goods movement and using e-cargo bikes as a tool? In many ways, we see a lot of research and development happening in other cities. Calgary is a little bit behind. But that gives us an opportunity. It gives us an even bigger reason to be inspired and to think about how we can play in this space. Cities where these kind of bikes really have taken off include Amsterdam. If you've been to Amsterdam, you'll know that it's, along with the rest of the Netherlands, just a place where people are bike crazy for good reason. And there are many benefits to that. And people have integrated the bike with personal mobility on many levels. We also see in Denmark, there are great examples of mobility. And this bike, for example, was designed in Copenhagen, a city also very well known. If you've not been there, it's worth a visit. Lots of bikes if you go around the downtown of Copenhagen. Growth is another important driver. And we're not only talking about economic growth or economic development, we're speaking about efficient urban mobility in this space. As we've heard in the previous presentation and what Amanda was touching on previously as well, there is more activity in our cities. There is growth happening in terms of population, in terms of the expediency of delivering goods and services. So efficiency really is key, and we see there is demand for more efficient goods movement in cities as more and more people compete for that space where the robots go, where the cars should not be going, where we go, and where the bikes for personal use are also going. So that is another area where I think a lot of our attention is focused. And then also policy. We see a lot of growth in non-motorized transportation policy in different cities, and Calgary is no different. We're not immune to that. The future of transportation definitely on a policy level is moving towards greater integration of e-bike policies that are driving the kind of implementation we see in how people interact with bikes on a day-to-day space, how they can cut GHG emissions in the process and create a healthier and friendlier environment for how our goods are moved. Then another driver into electric cargo mobility really is by industry, and that is wonderful to see because industry is where most of these changes happen. A lot of the R&D that we see is applied by industry, and many of our delivery companies, be it Purolator or FedEx or others, they are the ones that make use of this. They are the ones who help us to see this momentum out there that we see every day. So one thing I want to touch on is mobility as a service, or MaaS as it's called, and that really is something which also is an opportunity to include really, you know, what we see around here, the kind of futuristic things in the center, because mobility as a service is a new way of thinking around mobility, using apps to book vehicles, maybe for a single use, or otherwise, and being able to pay seamlessly as long as we have interoperability between the different back-end systems and the vehicle that you are using for a specific time frame.
Thank you.
There are also some barriers. As with most things that we see around electric mobility, there are a couple of challenges, and we need to acknowledge those. So one of them is the user experience. In many cases, there was a question from someone or a comment previously about some autonomous vehicles that had an accident in Ontario. That is a user experience. And similar with e-bikes, there are a couple of risks around human safety and the safety of goods, especially if you are transporting fragile goods. On top of that, we've got the common questions around electric mobility, which is range anxiety and the charging network. So as we are experimenting in this space, it would be very useful for us to think about how to address those two issues. And I know within our team, we are thinking about this a lot. Strategically, how to reduce that range anxiety so that we can create a positive or positive conditions for user experience to be improved. And the same with charging networks. because those go hand in hand. If you're not able to keep the e-bike on the move, then you will have a couple of challenges. Also related to that is the infrastructure question. In some cases, we need to rethink our land uses, signage. Maybe it's useful to think about hubs, where one can operate some of these bikes from. There's a picture I'm going to show you a bit later where hubs of electric mobility are really enabling the success of this kind of e-bike business model. But it really is about systems thinking. It's about networks, it's about hubs, and then having the complementary land use that comes with that. And relating to the previous presentation as well, we have to look at the political economy around electric mobility. And with that, I mean social perceptions, public acceptance. In some cases, it may be that we need a bit more communication with the public to create the understanding about where the benefits are for some folks in Calgary to make use of these bikes. In terms of policy and vision and regulatory frameworks, there is always more work to do. As we know, innovation is something which happens organically, and relating to what Travis mentioned as well, with some technologies, one moves back a step, you take 2 steps forward. And that is just the territory on which we see these things happen. So with that, one needs to have a certain degree of flexibility within policy and regulations.
Great. Okay, so we have a good background of the why this is happening and some of the enablers and barriers to it. So now let's look at this in practice. We can start with the evolution of e-cargo bike policies to help further explain that why.
So if we think about, or maybe a question, if you know, put up your hand. Who knows when the first cargo bike was used? This is not your general kind of dinner table question, but does anyone know how old is the cargo bike? If you don't, no pressure.
150 years.
Close, but very optimistic. But apparently, according to research, in 1923, the first commercial cargo bike was put onto the road. It was not in Calgary, sadly. So the cargo bike is nothing new. We've seen it around for over 100 and something years. And over a century, there's been a lot of experimentation. So policy promotion pre-2010, I just called it pre-2010 because it's an easier frame of reference. We've seen a new kind of civic development of new technologies. And because of population growth in cities since 1923, there has been a lot more interest in bikes. So there's naturally been also a lot of different options. People were experimenting. And just like we are today, we are thinking increasingly how can we make cargo bikes more efficient, more useful, more user-friendly, more comfortable, convenient. We think also about short-term actions. In some cases, technologies around this kind of bike development, we need to think in short-term steps in order to reach the bigger steps later. So short-term thinking is very useful for this kind of experimentation, but ultimately, if you look back at the last 100 years of cargo bike usage, the goal has always been mobility. That's been the end use. And different steps were taken to reach that. With technology changing all the time, some short-term actions are seen as, well, hey, this doesn't work. So we try something else. Also, delivery patterns have changed. We can see the reconfiguration of that as we have different developments around the city happening with street design, street policy, and just people's behavior. So that kind of very quick overview tells us that the policy promotion since 1923 has only grown, and looking ahead, it will only grow a lot more, and that is where folks like Amanda and myself come in. Looking at more or less 2011 to 2020, there is a growing rise globally for having policies that consider noise reduction. People want to feel zen when you live in a busy environment. This provides zen if you are feeling overwhelmed. Refined targets and policy directives are also very common. If you look at other cities, if you look at also federal research that's come out, there is a constant tweaking and refining of certain policy interventions, targets about how many e-bikes in a certain space can be safe or should be considered. So policy and regulations really helping to balance out where industry may be a bit slow or a bit too quick. The rise of mass market e-mobility options is happening. As we see with the electric car, the passenger vehicle, the numbers of adoption, or if you look at the numbers of how many people are driving e-vehicles, is increasing. There may be a few market bumps along the way, but the trajectory is on the up. We also see in many different cities, especially here in Canada, land use efficiency is a big driver. So that is a very critical area in which to think about how to incorporate cargo bikes. And there's a lovely picture there of a little trike with some kind of, don't know what that is, but I suppose one can use that for various deliveries, maybe even take a nap inside it if you want a stand-up nap, if you can. And then if we think about the current state, we are seeing the acceleration of e-bike adoption. In many cities, I mentioned Copenhagen, I've mentioned others, we've heard about Toronto, but even here in Calgary, there is a sense of acceleration of e-bike adoption required to address the needs of delivery of goods and even people. There are more and more solutions coming up to close the gaps and the barriers to adoption. People are thinking very innovatively about how can we address safety, how can we address sidewalk safety. We had a case recently hearing of someone who went over a bump on a sidewalk and the bicycle was damaged. This was not with a cargo bike, just a personal bike. So that makes you think, you know, if we are delivering goods, you know, smooth surfaces are important. So there's more attention being paid to these kind of things. Then also, very importantly, to tie this back to the times that we live in, alignment of climate goals and priorities with innovative zero emissions goods movement is really something that drives a lot of the policies we have today, and also the progress we see in industry is also conversely driving some of the policy tweaks that we've seen around electric mobility. And this is the picture I was referring to. There we've got a BMW, I think it's an i3 if I'm not mistaken. There is a cargo bike, there is a motorized bike, and there are a couple of other e-bikes, all within a hub. And I think this is somewhere in the UK. I found this picture, I've seen it a few times, but it really tells a wonderful story of how electric mobility hubs can build our communities. And you have goods movement delivery options right there. You've got personal mobility of different choices. This is an example of sustainable mobility options in practice in a neighborhood.
Great, thank you. So as you can see from these pictures and all the other ones that we've had beforehand, there are certainly a range of different bike options and e-cargo bike options. So when we look at technology, to simplify the differences between them, we can think about e-cargo bikes as being placed on a spectrum, where what shifts along this spectrum is the number of wheels the bike has, the type of commodity that is transported, and also the typical payload that a bike can have. And so payload is it references the weight that a bike is towing in addition to its rider. And it's quite significant. So I recommend that you pay attention to this slide because I am going to be asking you a couple of questions about how these bikes might operate in practice in the next slide. Okay, so on the spectrum, if we look at the e-bike on the far left side, so this is where we have conventional bikes, e-bikes that are fitted with baskets or racks. And what's suitable here, if we think about the types of commodities that are going to be transported here, this is something that you would see most likely in use with a personal vehicle. So an individual who's commuting about their daily lifestyle, what are they transporting with it? And most commonly what you will see are groceries. So I needed to go get 3 items from the grocery store. This is a really great option for that rather than jumping in my car. In my neighborhood, I see these styles of bikes most often being used to transport children, and they are fitted in so many different ways as ways to actually protect children from weathers, including complete weather screens and tops to prevent rain and snow from getting at them. And then lastly, from the commercial angle, this style of bike can be really good for moving around small electronics or mail. But as we step up on this spectrum, where the e-trike comes in, so with the addition of another wheel, higher battery wattage and capacity, and a larger box, the payload potential changes quite significantly. And this is what makes them more suitable for commercial uses. So what I actually forgot to say is on the conventional side, the two-wheeled e-bike, the payload there, you're likely able to carry an additional 100 pounds of weight when you are moving with the conventional style of bike. With the e-trike, you're able to carry up to 700 pounds just as it is. But if you add a trailer with it, then you can get even more weight on it. So from the commercial standpoint, what's really great to move here is where we have business-to-business deliveries, such as moving product between a retailer and a store, or a warehouse and a store, or even moving meals between restaurants can be a really great use case for using the e-trike. Other uses are where we have more Amazon-style uses, where Amazon has centralized mini hubs that they use to shift consumer parcels from their hubs straight to commuters' doors. So that's how the technology works and how it ranges along the spectrum. In practice, we have a company here called Cornucopia Logistics. They operate out of a very well-known and dense American city, and their whole fleet is 100% e-bikes. So this is an e-bike with a backloaded box and also supported with an additional trailer. So if you were to guess, take a moment to really think about a logistics company and what they might be helping to move around the city. What do you think is moving around on this bike? Any guesses? Just shout them out. Food. Okay, food. Groceries. Yeah, great guess. Anything else?
Office supplies.
Fantastic. Okay, and where do we think it is? I think it's a well-known, very dense American city. New York. Perfect. All right, and how heavy do you think their payload is?
It's filled with puff wheat, so 40 pounds.
Great guess. Okay. So you're all right on the money here. So this company is moving groceries in Manhattan, New York City, with an average payload of up to 300 pounds. What's really impressive about this company is that they essentially can move around. They can use one bike to deliver to 5 customers on a route that takes 2 hours, and they're moving around that route. The route size is about 16 kilometers, and that takes them about 2 hours to do. So with the whole company, they can serve up to an average of 12,500 customers per week with a full fleet size of 200 e-cargo bikes, which is quite significant if you think about this as being, this is a logistics company whose whole operation is with e-cargo bikes. Now we have another company that I will profile here, but don't worry, I'll fill in the gaps for you. What's really interesting about this company is they are using a bike that is very similar to the Larry versus Harry model here, and they do have that front-loaded box. They operate in one community serving one style of customer, and that is, so they're moving mail, small parcels, and stationery on the University of Washington campus in Seattle. They measure their payload in terms of liters, so this can vary just depending on the size of parcel that they are moving around. But what's interesting about how they're operating is they're operating on a campus space that is typically very pedestrian oriented. So they're operating in a space that can be very difficult to operate with traditional vehicles, such as delivery vans and trucks. And they're doing so in a way that their route is 7 kilometers. They're serving up to 80,000 customers at a time in a route that will only take them an hour to do. But what's really interesting about how this company is choosing to operate is that it's a mix. So we have e-cargo bikes and vans who are presented in this mix. And so essentially what that says is that working with e-cargo bikes is really not a one-size-fits-all approach. And so when logistics companies are considering this, what's a main draw for them is typically that e-cargo bikes do offer flexibility, especially when we start to consider their performance metrics alongside other traditional forms of freight movement.
So, I'm sure we all know the concept here of time is money. And the picture on the left here is, again, from the US. I think it's also in New York. This is not the full picture, I cropped it, but the point is that this happens in the US too much. The road space is being used as a what looks like a delivery gone wrong. There are a whole lot of cars parked behind this truck, and it is very difficult for people to move around this truck. And the poor guy who has to do the actual delivery of the boxes looks like he's also having a hard time. And in the meantime, his truck is idling, so he is wasting fuel. He is contributing to pollution in the city, and he's holding up, apparently in this photo, up to 46 cars behind him, who are now also late for wherever they are going. Maybe they also are doing deliveries and cannot get to their destination because of what is happening here. So if we look at this across a number of US cities and even elsewhere, this is the kind of reality that makes goods movement frustrating for a lot of people. So the performance of this kind of bike, as we see in front here, is that you see optimization of operations. And I think that is already something which can help with the social acceptance. And also, you just don't have to spend so much time feeling sorry for the poor guy who's got to pick up all those boxes. There is also, through the use of e-cargo bikes, a very easy win. Nowadays, there is a lot of pressure on companies to have social sustainability indicators and to show that they are contributing to a cleaner, healthier environment. Using an e-cargo bike definitely gets you a win for that, and also creates a good feeling that you're doing the right thing and contributing. Bike-friendly infrastructure is another very important metric that we need to consider. If we think about how to displace that truck with all those boxes onto a bike lane, between buildings in a city like Calgary, we need to think about what kind of infrastructure do we need, what kind of infrastructure do we want, and what will be practical to make the e-goods movement and delivery efficient, expedient, and convenient. So in many cities, there is work being done on regulatory frameworks. And interestingly, if one dives into e-cargo bikes and their success, there is always a link between some form of regulatory framework that really drives people's behavior to what would be considered e-goods movement success. So the point is that policy and regulatory frameworks is something that really helps to drive the performance of how effective these vehicles are. And then also related to that is just land use. Again, speaking about hubs, mobility hubs. If we think back to the photo I showed earlier on, having hubs that are dedicated to e-mobility for goods movement may make it easier to avoid a situation like that on the photo where you've got boxes on a public road and being inconvenient for folks.
Yeah, definitely not an ideal situation to deal with. So if we tap into one of the operational efficiency, the benefit side of this by looking at operational efficiency, we can run a comparative performance where we see how e-cargo bikes are operating alongside their more traditional counterparts. So this data does come from a case study that was run in Seattle, Washington, and it compared essentially the performance metrics of all operators who are using e-cargo bikes with other operators who are just using the cargo vans. And so essentially what's seen here, and the big draw of e-cargo bikes, is that they are nimble, they're agile, and they typically can move a lot faster. And they do so by largely avoiding congestion because they have the opportunity to use additional infrastructure that delivery vans don't really have the option to use. So here, what we're seeing is that when using an e-bike, the comparative performance is that e-bikes are spending more time driving than than delivery vans, but they're also spending less time parking on average. And so when we think about their routes and how they're navigating the differences between driving and parking, e-bikes do have more options. Again, they can move on roads, bike lanes, sidewalks, and potentially other infrastructure that might be available in pedestrian spaces, whereas parcel vans are largely, again, only able to operate on roads or in those limited shared spaces that we do have available. What I found interesting, but not surprising when you start to get into the numbers, is that with e-bikes, they are making fewer deliveries per stop, whereas with parcel vans, they do more deliveries on average. But parking is a challenge for parcel vans. When they do park, their delivery drivers are often having to walk a lot farther between where they're parking and where their deliveries are, which can eat into their overall time in dropping off parcels. Whereas with e-bikes, because of the addition of sidewalk infrastructure that they can use, on average, they're parking a lot closer to their destinations, which, when we look at average speed, does lead to faster delivery times for e-bikes in comparison to these cargo vans. But naturally, what's really interesting to think about here is, like, from the urban logistics angle, it does make sense from an efficiency standpoint to consider how e-bikes can supplement their routes, but doing so does put additional safety pressure on pedestrians when e-bikes are operating in spaces that are shared with pedestrians or other road users. So naturally, as Travis has said, as Conrad has mentioned a couple of times, there is a balance to strike here when we think about how e-bikes can operate within the goods movement space.
So, something that keeps our minds busy at public spaces and mobility policy is making sense of it. How do we make sense of this? And we have challenges and we have options. So, needless to say, and very apt for being in the WAVE Center today, research is important, experimenting is important, looking at best practices. Best practices change, just a caveat there. Something which may have been a best practice 10 years ago may not be a best practice anymore today. So continuous learning is just very important. And as we figure out the questions and the answers that we need to look at research. We need to do local research right here in Calgary. But also look beyond Calgary where people have done similar things before and where we don't have to reinvent the wheel, excuse the pun. But importantly, having a very steady focus on research and credible research, that's really critical. So that's one piece. Doing the research, doing the planning, doing the thinking, we need time to think. But then once we've done our thinking, once we've done some research, once we have a solid understanding of it, we need to put that into action somehow. So we can look at our corporate processes, be it at the city, be it private industry. Every organization out there has procedures and cultures, ways of doing things. So depending on how we do things will also determine how quickly we adopt or not adopt things like this blue e-bike here. Education and awareness is very important. And at the city, as many of you will know or are involved with yourself, there is a lot of awareness being raised about the kind of city we want to see today, tomorrow, and into the future. A lot of that goes back to speaking with people, making sure we can educate and show our curiosity to other people and listen to people's questions and suggestions about how to improve public spaces and the kind of mobility that intersects with that space. We have options around cooperative hubs. I go back to the photo I showed you earlier on. The best practices nowadays show that to have a bigger uptake of e-mobility, and regardless if we're speaking about small vehicles or larger vehicles, even trucks and buses, we need to think about cooperative collaboration hubs or just dedicated spaces in which, from which we can then distribute these vehicles, whether doing goods movement or moving people. Things that we've seen as well is just updated policies and bylaws. This is a lengthy process because policies and bylaws do not happen overnight. That requires a lot of thinking, a lot of discussion, and compromise. But by doing that continuously, we see progress. And then to address some of the key actions, and this is something which is not just for Calgary, this is for whether you are other cities as well, pilot projects. The ability to experiment, the ability to collect local data and to have case studies to show that, yes, this is working and here are the reasons. And this did not go so well, so we'll avoid this in the future. But being allowed to play is critical, and we've seen many other cities having tremendous success by figuring these things out practically. And that also helps us to build a better framework around how to understand the trends that are out there, because we are bombarded with information about, oh, this is the next big thing, or this is the next big thing. It can be a bit overwhelming. So to keep the focus and to find clarity, all of the above help us to understand how to think about the technologies that are available and how to use them and how we fit into this bigger movement that is e-cargo bikes. Then it's important also, from our perspective, to prioritize impact, because ultimately mobility is not so much about the bike itself, it's about people. People are using this bike. They move things. So the experience of using that piece of equipment is the important piece, the impact. And then the flexibility around how we implement this. So we cannot be too rigid around implementing e-cargo bikes. There will need to be some flexibility around which areas in the city it might be best suited for, and under what terms that can happen. And then technology as well. There is so much technology out there. It's always important to have choices and to avoid what I call path dependencies, where you go down one specific road and get stuck on it because things change beyond from what you can see right now. So that also leads me to think about the implementation and the data that we speak about. Learning from our experiences and having our own little arsenal of information about why something works well in Calgary, why something should go ahead or be tweaked is really important. And that is also something where we can, I think, teach and share knowledge. And I think that's so important. So, speaking about policy connections, as a city, we need to have a toolbox of policies. Do we have those tools? Yes, we do. If we look at our climate strategy, that is one of the guiding documents here at the city in order to think about the future of lower carbon emissions and also importantly zero emissions and how to get there. So if we think about it, by 2030, the climate strategy gives us ambition for 100% of new livery vehicles to be zero emissions. By 2050, which is not that far away, 100% of all vehicles are zero emissions vehicles. And the climate strategy gives us some of the tools to do some of that. We have the Calgary Transportation Plan in its current form, which tells us that 100% zero emissions vehicles by 2050 is important. That aligns with our climate strategy. Reducing transportation operating costs for Calgarians. Critical. Mode shift towards sustainable modes and the reduction in vehicle kilometers per capita. That is also important. And we've got options like this e-bike to help us achieve that. There are also other tools we have, like the goods movement strategy. There is also the Future of Transportation document that guides us how to think about certain things into the future as we try to be proactive around the future of transportation and all the benefits that it brings. So I've mentioned that already, but it's important to think about the sustainable transportation modes for goods delivery. It's part of industrial development, industrial decarbonization, and our industries are important. And as the city works to, maintain the options for innovation in the industrial space and the commercial space, all of this really works together, and we continuously try to improve how we apply these policy connections and create more connections between them.
All right, so to wrap up this presentation on our chained reaction, Calgary already has a very well-established multimodal goods movement network. As you can see from this map, the network primarily composes main truck routes, rail lines, and then also hubs that are accessible by plane at the Calgary International Network. So as we are thinking about what is next or what is already here, we're definitely mindful of the fact that operators are seeking additional pathways as to how they move goods through different parts of the city. And this just gives you an idea of how goods are already moving within different quadrants of the city and across different quadrants of the city. And a part of our role as the city of Calgary is that we are enablers. We are enablers of thinking about different ways to help support the pathways that are already here, and we're infrastructure builders. So we do need to be mindful of the fact that these changes are en route, they're coming quickly, and to just sit and do nothing doesn't necessarily help our urban logistics companies or operators in this space continually to operate in ways that tackle social, environmental, and economic good. So we're listening. And Jason, how much time do we have overall?
We're free after this.
Oh, okay. So if you do have additional time to stay around and workshop with us, we do have a couple of questions to think about how do we do this as a city? Like, we definitely have some really great pathways that are already started, but there's more work to be done. So I guess I'll open up the floor now to just general questions, and then I do have a couple of questions to throw back at you as well.
All right, let's take 2 questions, and then we'll go into workshop if people can stick around. Alessandro.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. It's really interesting and awesome. Just wondering something, how you guys are going to tackle the fact, so it's an e-bike, and the weather in Calgary, as we all know, it's kind of a difficult topic. So are you considering any AI, any implementation of technology? Is there any talk about that, you know, like, I don't know, maybe eating, some sort of eat sensor that can be attached to the e-bike when the e-bike goes around the city? So just how you gonna deal with that? Thank you.
Well, I think the big piece here was that this is industry using the cargo bikes, right? So that would be up to FedEx or Pizza Hut or Bo Cycle to put that on themselves. We're not requiring any AI enabled, or even like, there could be companies doing delivery right now that they don't have to register a cargo bike.
And also what we've seen, there is a company in England called Eve, EAV. They have built a e-bike for cargo where you have that protective screen in front, and you have a bit of a, as far as I can tell, there is an option to keep warm. But yeah, I think if you are driving this in Calgary in the wintertime, definitely one would want to put something, some covering on, and also dress appropriately. But it's being done. It's all about trip planning. If you are applying for a job as an e-goods bike guy or gal, then it's important to dress accordingly, just like you would if you were to take a conventional bike and cycle to work at minus 42.
One of our presenters this afternoon does e-cargo bike because she does dropping off her kids, her family, before she comes to work, and she uses studded tires and rides year round. But go ahead.
Yeah, just to tack on to that, we actually do have Purelator, who has operated a pilot already in Calgary, and that was something they had to tackle, was how to move amid snow. I don't have the numbers for it because they weren't released publicly, but we do have driver satisfaction surveys that came out, and generally what drivers said is their delivery routes were not impacted amid snow and cold. And a part of that is that the cycle routes are largely cleared within 24 hours of snowfall, so that's something that the city is already actively managing, recognizing that a lot of people like to maintain their active modes through different times of year. And the people who are going to be riding in winter situations, they're already bought in. Like, they know what it takes to be safe within a winter environment. And again, as a city, as demand is growing, it is essential for us to respond to that in ways that helps maintain that safety.
Sandra.
Just a comment to support your presentation, and particularly on the snow removal or winter considerations. I'm often downtown, and I notice that at the onset of a snowfall, the bike lanes are the first to be cleared before sidewalks, before roadways. And there are so many people using the bike lanes, it is astronomical. And in any temperature of weather, it could be 35, 40 below, and people are still using the bike lanes, and they are well traveled. Yeah.
All right, Dave, and then let's go to workshop.
Hi, excellent presentation, very interesting. Just wondering if you have any other stats that can help us predict adoption. For instance, do you have the stats on like kilometer, cost per kilometer per volume, cost per kilometer per weight, and then how different technologies, like before e-bikes, manual deliveries versus e-bikes now, and how that brings the cost per kilometer down, and how it compares to things like trucks and roadways. From that type of trending, we should be able to predict when mass adoption is going to happen?
Yeah, we do have that information. I don't have it all at the top of my head right now, but I can definitely provide you with that from our files. But what I want to share with you is that if you look at a common example is studies out of the UK, where an e-bike company looked at exactly this kind of question that you raised about cost. And very often the final mile is the most expensive part of any delivery. So in goods movement, that is going to be the critical piece. If one can decarbonize and, let's just say, make it cost effective, the final mile can really achieve multiple things. And up to 50% in the UK of the final delivery happens, or the cost is associated with that final mile. And of course, if you have different payload opportunities on these bikes, you can then lower that cost in terms of delivery within a neighborhood, and also reduce GHG emissions at the same time. So yeah, I can send you more details, but ultimately, yes, the final mile is the expensive piece, and that's where our focus definitely should be.
Great. Okay, we'll get to your questions. And Brindis Whitson, a logistics guru, is in the audience. So I'm hoping for some insightful answers from you, Brindis.
Okay. You said Bridget? Brindis? Okay, I'm just going to put you on the spot then. So, so just generally, what brought you here today, and like, why are you interested in this topic?
So part of the reason I was really interested in this topic was more because of how does goods kind of interact throughout the city, but also how do we make sure that kind of we're utilizing the space correctly too. And also the one thing that really came up a lot as I was looking and listening to both of these topics has been how do we involve urban planning in all of this?
Okay, so thank you for that answer. That definitely does seem to be a bit of a gap in how we involve different players within this space. So I'll open up this question more generally. What additional gaps are you seeing either in how to invite more e-cargo bikes or how to get the additional players and actors together? It's a big question, I know, but no wrong answers.
I think people want to hear stories. They want to hear success stories, right? So when you have that pilot, or, you know, like there's a guy on Twitter, Maticus. He's a realtor photographer, and he uses his cargo bike to get everywhere from you know, I was going to say Panorama Hills, but that's not the suburbs anymore. But right, and he uses it all over, right, to get from east to west, and so following his social media timelines, you get to see the success stories, and I think we want to see more of that. How, whether it's a spice company in Inglewood to a food delivery, we want to see that other people are making it work, and then then we want to make the investment as a company. I'll go to Christina.
It seems like most of your work is focused on city.
Hi. Most of your work seems to be focused on enabling private industry to use e-cargo bikes and making sure the infrastructure is in place and our policies, et cetera. But what about the use of this for us internally? So with the city of Calgary, like administration. We have, like, this is just like a very small example, but we use like inter-office mail. I see that still being done by light-duty fleet vehicles. So just wondering if we're using it internally, and that could be an example to test our systems and use the data that way.
Yeah, those are two really great comments. Like one, like we definitely have to humanize the technology to help promote adoption, and then also potentially be the leaders of the technology use to show that it does work. Yeah, really great example.
Okay, Sandra, I'm coming. We have a cargo bike here that was part of just IT's fleet, so we've commandeered it, and so we've used it to We've attached a camera on it and used it to film fences along pathways, and we'll use it to carry gear back and forth to a platform while we're there. But we haven't had a space to keep it, and then we don't all have access to the basement here, so we're hoping to use it more. And then there's a whole fleet of bikes down there that we can use that have been locked up forever, but now that we've got space, they're open for people to use. Sandra, and then I'll go back.
To attract commercial enterprise adoption, it has to be a solid business case. And because right now, if I'm a logistics company or a company that relies on delivery of goods, I'm looking at that bike as a capital cost, and it's a depreciating asset. And now I also have to hire someone to be able to deliver. So now I have additional cost with human resources, human capital. And then also taking a look at what kind of goods do I deliver that, because now I have a restricted payload as opposed to a larger commercial vehicle. So there's a lot of different moving parts, and it also depends on the type of business, the payloads they're delivering, who they're delivering to, where they're delivering to. So there's a lot of different moving parts to be able to convince commercial enterprise to adopt e-bikes. And the delivery, no pun intended, is in the data. The more, excuse me, the more data you have to support various different business cases, that's where the adoption, that's where the adoption can be attracted. Thanks.
Yeah, that's definitely a very good point. And you really make I think you clarify the reality of many companies out there. So what we've seen at least is that a mixed fleet of delivery vehicles, including things like this, make it possible to offset some risks. If you were to think about it, if you are only operating e-bikes, it might be difficult as a logistics company. But if you have an e-van and you supplement with an e-bike, or you have an e-trike, that can be a way to minimize certain business risks, and also maybe to think about where your deliveries are taking place. If you don't need to use the van, you can use an e-bike. So it depends on the customer base you are serving. And in different cities, we've seen this kind of mixed fleet to be very cost effective and to be a way to grow the fleet. You experiment with maybe one e-bike, and then if it really works well, you buy another one. So the road to cleaner delivery is often done through various vehicles within the same logistics company.
Just a quick note on cost. So this Larry versus Harry bike is very expensive. So as of right now, it's selling on sale for $8,300. So that's definitely not a consumer model, and from a commercial standpoint, it's a pretty hefty investment. But as this technology has started to grow, the entry cost has decreased quite significantly. And we have new bike manufacturers in the space that are making more affordable bikes that do yield similar performance to this one here. So just something to think about on the business case side of things.
Okay, we've got one more question here. If you want to stick around and ask more or have more engaging conversation, we're happy to do so after, if you two have time. And then we're kicking back up at 1 o'clock with Jen Mulzer. But I'll pass it over to you for one last question.
Thank you. So mine is one a question, and the other one a comment related to the business case. So the question being is, I wonder, this map is very interesting. I wonder if this goods movement route conversation has been done with, let's say, transit or REDS for the city, because I want to understand if transit is planning on some BRT lines on this. So we have to do a cost-benefit analysis to understand which kind of infrastructural investment will be more beneficial, a BRT line versus an infrastructure for moving good cargo e-bikes, for example. And then REDS also can be an important place to investigate, because if you're thinking about housing, if you're thinking about residential development of density, these kind of movement makes more sense if you have more dense environment. So is these conversations happening? And the second piece is around operationalizing. If we have operators and logistic companies, like you mentioned, Purelator and FedEx, is there a demand that you're seeing that they're requesting municipalities to make infrastructural changes and investments? Is there consultations going on with these private entities? Because end of the day, I think the demand, it's a council-driven organization, so the demand will lead to infrastructural change. So yeah.
Very good points, Titesh. Thank you. So on what you say about transit-orientated development, I think that definitely is very important. So what I can say is that if we think back to the picture I showed with all the different policy documents that we are trying to integrate to get action on the ground, yes, we are chatting with REDS. Yes, we are chatting with people over at Transit. But I think what's interesting at the City of Calgary, and it's similar in other cities, different teams have different levels of pace at which they can do certain things. So the coordination of all of this is really quite important. And it's a longer conversation, but I think it's a classic case of governing for long problems and getting an e-bike onto a road that fits in with the kind of strategies that REDS is using, and looking at the TOD policies. Coordinating all of that requires a bit of time, but to answer your question, yes, we are having those conversations, but we always welcome more conversation, because we don't have all the answers. You have ideas, you have vision and suggestions, so please speak to us, because every, not step of the way, every roll of the wheel helps.
Right. And for our non-city or folks here and online, real estate and development services when we reserve to REDS. Yep. All right. Okay. Thank you both so much. You guys can stick around if you'd like. And yeah, we'll just mingle. We do, again, take a walk around. We're here. Some of us will be grabbing lunch before we start at 1, but get a tour, meet the team, chat with everybody. And if you have any more questions, we're around. Thanks.
Thank you.